You believe Bobby Fischer was classified as a threat by two global superpowers because of his erratic words. You assume that governments track an aging man across foreign borders because he said something offensive on a radio broadcast. That is the first misconception you must eliminate. Governments do not fear eccentric men with microphones. Governments fear sovereign individuals who invent repeatable systems to dismantle state monopolies. When the United States State Department and the Soviet intelligence apparatus monitored Fischer, they were not looking at a normal athlete. They were analyzing a dangerous cognitive anomaly. You were looking at a man who took on an industrial collective that spent millions of dollars, employed hundreds of grandmasters, and utilized state-sponsored psychological institutes. And he dismantled them entirely alone. He did not defeat them through emotional passion. He defeated them by applying a cold, mechanical philosophy of leverage. That made institutional power completely useless. Why did the Soviet chess machine rule the world uninterrupted for 24 years? You probably think they simply had better players. You imagine that Russian grandmasters were smarter, or that their culture valued intellectual combat more than the West did. That explanation is wrong. The Soviet Union dominated because they turned an individual game into a bureaucratic assembly line. When the Soviet player sat across from an opponent, that player was not thinking alone. Between rounds, a team of 20 analysts broke down every possible branch of the game. They studied the opponent's sleep patterns, their heart rate under pressure, their opening preferences, and their emotional weaknesses. The individual grandmaster was simply the terminal interface for a massive state computer. Now look at your own position in modern systems. You operate against corporations, institutions, and algorithms that possess infinitely more capital, data, and manpower than you will ever own. If you fight an institution on the terms of the institution, you lose every time. You cannot out-process a collective. You cannot outspend a state. Fischer understood this dynamic before he turned 20. He did not try to build a competing committee. He created a strategy based on three operational laws: absolute reductionism, the weaponization of objective truth, and the total liquidation of systemic ambiguity. How do you break a system that is 10 times larger than you? You do not add complexity, you strip it away. Most people believe chess mastery is the ability to calculate 50 moves ahead. You imagine a master looking at a chaotic board and seeing a massive, branching tree of millions of possibilities. When beginners try to improve, they try to memorize opening books. They memorize 10,000 lines of theory. They drown themselves in data. Fischer proved that complexity is the ultimate cover for incompetence. When you study Fischer's games, you do not see chaotic fireworks. You see ruthless clarity. His entire philosophy was based on a single operational principle. Find the single most direct move that alters the structural reality of the board, and force the opponent to react to physical law rather than psychological preference. The Soviet school taught that chess was an art form filled with psychology. Mikhail Tal played moves that were objectively flawed, but psychologically terrifying. Tigran Petrosian played moves that were suffocating and defensive, waiting for you to become bored and make a mistake. They played the human across the table. Fischer refused to play the human. He said, "I do not believe in psychology. I believe in good moves." Think about what happens when you adopt that philosophy. The moment you stop reacting to the personality, the status, or the reputation of your opponent, their entire psychological apparatus collapses. You stop respecting their titles. You stop respecting their history. You reduce the conflict to pure leverage. In 1971, Fischer played Mark Timonov, an elite Soviet grandmaster, backed by the full power of the USSR sports ministry. Fischer did not just beat him, he beat him 6-0, 0 draws. In high-level chess, a clean sweep is statistically near impossible. Timonov was so thoroughly dismantled that the Soviet government stripped him of his titles, took away his salary, and banned him from traveling abroad because they suspected he had committed political treason. They could not accept that a single mind could execute with such absolute mathematical perfection. 2 months later, Fischer played Bent Larsen, one of the strongest Western players in history. Fischer beat him 6-0, another clean sweep. How did he generate this level of structural output? Look at the mechanics of how he handled board friction. When you manage any project, business or competitive conflict, you deal with friction. Friction is the noise between your decision and the physical result. Weak operators love friction because friction allows them to hide their mistakes behind excuses. Large institutions survive on friction because bureaucracy creates delays that protect inefficient actors. Fischer designed a methodology to eliminate friction through forced liquidation. When you watch Fischer play with the white pieces, he almost always opened with the same move, pawn to e4. He called it best by test. He did not waste time experimenting with 20 different experimental systems to confuse his opponent. He chose the move that applied immediate, maximum control over the center of the board. From that single anchor point, his strategy was invariant. First, develop your pieces to their most active squares immediately. Second, identify the opponent's primary defensive asset. Third, systematically eliminate that asset, even if it requires trading your own favorite piece. Most players fall in love with their own pieces. You fall in love with your own assets, your own ideas, and your own past investments. You keep a knight on the board because it looks powerful. Fischer had zero emotional attachment to his assets. If his opponent had a bishop that held their position together, Fischer would trade a superior piece just to remove that structural pillar. Once the pillar was gone, the opponent's position became an empty shell. Then came the endgame. In the endgame, when most players were exhausted and looking for a safe draw, Fischer became lethal. Why? Because the endgame removes all noise. There are no longer 30 pieces on the board to create confusion. There are only kings, pawns, and raw geometry. In raw geometry, you cannot hide behind institutional theory. You either understand the mechanical truth of the square, or you die. Fischer treated every conflict as a race toward an endgame, where his opponent's structural defects would become fatal. Now look at the summer of 1972 in Reykjavik, Iceland. The World Championship match between Bobby Fischer and Boris Spassky. This was not a board game. This was the cultural peak of the Cold War. The entire ideological superiority of the Eastern Bloc was pinned to Spassky's crown. What did Fischer do before he even touched a pawn? He attacked the operational environment. You watched him make demands that the public called childish madness. He demanded that the television cameras be removed from the hall because they made a faint buzzing sound. He demanded that the lighting be completely rebuilt to eliminate glare. He demanded that the spectators be pushed back several rows. He forfeited the second game entirely by simply refusing to show up in the playing hall. You might think this was the behavior of an unstable egomaniac. Look closer at the leverage. By refusing to conform to the standard operating procedures of the match, Fischer forced the entire Soviet delegation, including the world champion, the Soviet ambassador, and the sports ministry in Moscow, to spend 100% of their cognitive bandwidth managing logistical chaos. Spassky was accustomed to absolute order. He was accustomed to a comfortable stage, a structured routine, and a predictable environment provided by the state. Fischer stripped away that order. He introduced total systemic volatility. When you face an opponent with superior collective resources, your first move must be to destabilize their comfort baseline. If you allow a large organization to operate under standard conditions, their resource advantage will grind you down. You must force the battle into an unstructured environment where every decision must be made in real time without a manual. Then came Game 6. For his entire life, Fischer had played pawn to e4 on the first move. The Soviets had prepared for e4 for decades. They had compiled thousands of pages of deep theoretical responses to every single variation Fischer had ever played. Spassky sat down at the board, expecting the standard war. Fischer pushed his queen's bishop pawn to c4. He had played this move only a handful of times in his life. In a single second, Fischer rendered 20 years of state-funded Soviet research completely obsolete. Spassky looked at the board, and his safety net was gone. He had to think for himself from move one. Fischer did not play an aggressive, wild, tactical game. He played a quiet, positional masterpiece. He created a minor positional weakness in Spassky's pawn structure, slowly restricted every active square Spassky's pieces could move to, and cleanly executed the game with zero risk. When the game ended, Boris Spassky stood up and applauded his opponent alongside the audience. The Soviet machine had not just been beaten. Its entire philosophy of collective intellectual dominance had been shattered by a single sovereign mind. Why did this philosophy eventually isolate him from the world? This is the dark law of absolute reductionism that you must understand before you apply it to your own life. Fischer demanded that the entire world operate with the exact same precision, honesty, and logic as the 64 squares of a chessboard. In 1975, when he was scheduled to defend his world title against Anatoly Karpov, Fischer presented the International Chess Federation with a list of non-negotiable conditions. He demanded that the match be won by the first player to win 10 games, with draws, not counting, and that the champion retain the title if the score reached 9-9. He was not asking for money. He was asking for what he believed to be the pure mathematical definition of a championship. When the Federation refused to accept all of his terms, what did he do? He did not negotiate. He did not compromise. He vacated the title. He walked away from millions of dollars and disappeared into obscurity for nearly 2 decades. Later, in his life, he invented Fischer Random Chess, now known as Chess 960. He wanted to randomize the starting positions of the back rank pieces. Why? Because he believed that opening memorization had murdered the true human intelligence of the game. He wanted to destroy the entire publishing industry of chess books and force players to think from absolute scratch on every move. He could not tolerate human institutions because human institutions are built on compromise, social consensus, and useful fictions. Fischer saw only the binary reality of the board. A move is either correct or it is an error. When you apply this level of thinking to human relationships, politics, or society, you break the machine, and then the machine breaks you. Fischer ended his life as an exile, pursued by his own government for violating international sanctions. Stateless, paranoid, and alienated from the very world he had conquered. You do not need to adopt his madness to use his operational leverage. You must extract the core strategic architecture and leave the human tragedy behind. When you look at your current problems, your projects, or your competitors, ask yourself these direct structural questions. Are you playing the personality of your competition? Or are you executing the objective requirements of your board? Are you drowning yourself in complexity and memorizing other people's playbooks because you are afraid to simplify the problem to its root mechanical reality? Are you allowing an inefficient institution to dictate the lighting, the timing, and the rules of engagement? Or are you forcing the conflict into an environment where your sovereign clarity destroys their collective bureaucracy? Strip away the noise. Remove your emotional attachment to assets that no longer control the center. Force your opponents into the endgame of absolute execution, where titles and resources mean nothing, and only the structural truth survives.